Okay, so welcome everybody. We'll talk about, or this lecture will deal with chapter 13, which deals with emotion and personality. So I guess let's just get into it. So, when we think about, say, emotions, emotions can be defined by their three basic components. First, emotions have distinct subjective feelings, or what we call affects, that are associated with them. So these are things that we feel personally that are unique to us. Second, emotions are accompanied by bodily changes, physiological changes, mostly in the nervous system. And these produce changes that are associated with breathing and heart rate, muscle tension, blood pressure, hormones, neurotransmitters, and even the way that we express ourselves through bodily and facial expressions or facial features. And third, emotions are accompanied by distinct action tendencies, or another way of putting that is that emotions are accompanied by increases in probabilities that we are going to exhibit certain types of behaviors. So when we think about three different components of emotion, we have that subjective feeling or affect. We have the physiological changes that come with emotions, and we also have these action tendencies, or these increased probabilities of certain types of behaviors being exhibited. So people will differ in their emotional reactions, even to the same event. So emotions are useful in making distinctions among individuals, and that's why personality psychologists are often interested in them. A reason why cognitive psychologists are becoming increasingly interested in emotion, along with social psychologists as well. These all represent, say, overlapping areas of interest in terms of understanding individual differences and emotions. Everything occurs in the brain, so there's certainly a cognitive component there. The way that we experience emotion is different, so there's that individual, let's say, differences or personality aspect to it. But as we'll see throughout this chapter, our environments often influence our emotions, and the types of behaviors that we display as we experience a given emotion. So some issues in emotion research that we'll touch on. There are several major issues which divide the field of emotion research, but we'll focus on let's say these two continuums, or these two, let's say, these two. It's so late. I'm losing my focus here. These two diametric, let's say. So the first is emotional states versus emotional traits, and the other is categorical versus dimensional approaches to emotion. So let's start off with taking a look at this type of back and forth between emotional states versus emotional traits. So we typically think of emotions as states that come and go, right? So somebody might get angry and then they get over it. A person might get sad. I mean, we all get angry, we all get sad, and then we're no longer angry, we're no longer sad. So in this sense, emotional states are transitory. They don't last forever. They come and go. They're situationally dependent, right? So when we talk about emotional states, this is more about what's going on in our particular environment, or what's going on in our lives at a particular point in time. Everybody is going to experience every type of emotion at some point in their lives. So the states depend more on the situation rather than the person. But we can also think of emotions as, say, dispositions or traits. For example, we often can characterize people by stating what emotions they frequently exhibit or express, right? So you might say, this person is very happy or very happy-go-lucky. They're very cheerful, right? Or you might say, well, that person, they're just, really angry. They're just an angry type of person. Doesn't mean that they're always happy-go-lucky or that they're always angry, but this is their general type of, let's say, mood, or this is the general type of emotion that they are expressing. So we could also think of emotions as, say, traits, and traits are considered to be, remember, the whole idea of this class, personality traits. Traits are considered to be internal to a person. They're not dependent necessarily on the situation at hand. They're more about, let's say, how a person generally is, their general disposition, their general nature, so to speak, right? So we can think of traits also as causing people to behave or feel in certain ways. So when it comes to emotional states, these are transitory. They're fleeting. They don't last. We all experience them. We get over them. More about the situation. Emotional traits are patterns of emotional reactions that a person consistently experiences across a variety of different situations. Doesn't mean they're only ever going to experience these types of emotions, but these are their, let's say, their average emotions or their likely emotions, right? Okay, so we could also think or approach, say, emotion and personality in terms of categorical versus dimensional approaches to emotion. So emotion researchers can basically be divided into two camps based on how they answer the question, quote unquote, what is the best way to think about emotions, right? So there's two major schools of thought in terms of answering that question. What's the best way to think of them? Some researchers suggest that emotions are best thought of as a small number of primary and distinct emotions. So things such as, say, anger, or joy, anxiety, sadness. So a small number of primary type of emotions. Other researchers or theorists suggest that emotions are best thought of as broad dimensions of experience, meaning that emotions can actually exist on a continuum, and that emotions, there's a lot of different emotions, and they exist on dimensions, particularly a dimension that ranges from, say, pleasantness or unpleasantness, right? So we'll see in a minute how this, let's say, how this is resolved, or maybe not necessarily resolved, but how this is, how statistical analysis, let's say, might be used to try to buttress one of these types of approaches over the other. I'm trying to be careful with my words, not to sound biased here. But those who think that primary emotions are the key, those few primary emotions that we all have, we would say that they are taking this categorical approach to emotions. So the categorical approach will focus on identifying a small number of primary and distinct emotions. The issue here is that there's a lack of consensus in terms of what criteria we should use for defining an emotion as a quote-unquote primary emotion, right? We kind of run into the same issue that we run into when we try to define, well, what is and what is not a personality trait. Who knows, right? I mean, there's personality traits. Ultimately, they describe people's dispositions. They describe their adjectives, right? And we got thousands of adjectives in our vocabulary. So how do we pick out ones that we're going to count as traits or not? So we kind of run into the same issue, or the same questions are raised when we take this type of categorical approach. But several researchers have come up with various criteria that we should use. Ekman, for example, requires that a primary emotion have a distinct facial expression that is recognized across cultures. And this is something that you might have seen in your Psych 100 or Psych 101 class, that humans, we tend to have pretty distinct facial expressions when we're expressing certain types of emotions, right? The problem that comes is that some of the behaviors and some of the facial expressions that we exhibit, we tend to exhibit those behaviors and facial expressions for multiple emotions, right? So we cry when we're sad, but we cry when we're happy, right? So sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But research shows that infants, very young infants, are able to recognize, and not just recognize, but also imitate facial expressions. And these facial expressions, particularly for the emotion of disgust, tend to be very consistent across cultures. So that suggests there is some innate or inborn type of emotional traits that we exhibit here. Okay, so another approach to understanding the complexity of emotion has been based on empirical research rather than on theoretical criteria. So we can think of the categorical approach as being more theory driven. The dimensional approach is more empirical or statistically driven. So the dimensional approach is based on empirical research rather than just theoretical criteria. Also, people rate themselves on a variety of emotions, and in this type of approach, the researcher will then apply statistical techniques to identify dimensions that are underlying these ratings, these self-report ratings. So again, this is factor analysis. A researcher is going to collect a bunch of data based on self-reports of emotion, then use factor analysis to try to narrow down all these different types of emotions to a handful of, say, primary or distinct type of emotions. So this approach to identifying these primary emotions is driven by data, driven by statistics, rather than just theory, right? So there is consensus among researchers on basic dimensions of things like pleasantness and unpleasantness, and arousal, high arousal versus low arousal, which we'll see a diagram in the next slide here that kind of, let's say, describes a lot, if not all, of what we might consider primary emotions on these two dimensions. Let's say an X and a Y type of dimension here. So this two-dimensional model suggests that every emotion that we experience can be described as a combination of pleasantness and unpleasantness, and either high arousal or low arousal. And I don't know if you were a strange kid like me, but I was a strange kid. I'm still a strange kid, right? And I used to have these thought experiments where I tried to get really reductionist in my thinking, right? In terms of like, okay, so what does it mean to be happy, right? And then I would say, well, it means that you're feeling good rather than feeling bad. And then I would say to myself, okay, so then what does feeling good mean versus feeling bad mean, right? And I say, well, one gives you pleasure and the other does not, right? And then I would say, okay, so then what exactly does pleasure mean, right? And then yada, yada, yada. I would do these types of thought experiments. And then, once I went to graduate school and I learned factor analysis and structural equation modeling, I'm like, well, that's basically what I was doing in my head, like all these years. But the point that I'm trying to make is that's essentially what these types of approaches do. We try, using factor analysis, we try to take, say, maybe 100 different types of emotions and figure out, well, what do they really boil down to, right? So 100 different types of emotions might only boil down to 5 or 10 types of primary emotions, right? And researchers who take this dimensional approach say, well, yeah, most of our emotions statistically can actually be plotted on this two-dimensional graph, which is right here, right? So we're really talking about pleasantness and unpleasantness, and on the other axis, high arousal or low arousal, right? Or activation, what it's called here. So let's just take a look in terms of the different emotions that might exist on these two planes. So if you have high activation or high arousal, and it's pleasant, we're on the pleasant side, so we're high up here in pleasantness. So let's say high pleasantness and high activation here. People might feel elated or excited, enthusiastic. People who, let's say, are neutral, medium on the activation level, but still high on the pleasant side. They might be happy, delightful, cheerful, pleased, right? So they're happy, but they're not like happy, crazy, whoa type of stuff. People who are still on the pleasant side of this dimension, but who are lower in activation, might feel relaxed, or they might feel content, right? They're chill, essentially. So they're low key, but still feeling pretty good. Let's go on the other side of this dimension, the unpleasant side, right? So on this other dimension, this unpleasantness, people with high arousal, so you're highly aroused in an unpleasant way. You might feel distressed and anxious and hostile. People who are on this unpleasant side of the continuum, but not, but let's say just neutral or somewhere in between high and low arousal, they might feel just unhappy and sad and kind of just blue, like feel down, kind of, right? And people who are low in arousal, but who are also on this unpleasant dimension, might feel bored or sluggish or dull, kind of like dragging themselves through life type of way. And yeah, I'm sure we've all felt all of these at some point in our lives, but according to some research, some of us experience, some of these more than others. Okay, so another distinction that is useful to personality psychologists is that between the content of a person's emotional life and the style with which that person experiences and expresses that emotion. So you and I might both feel the same type of emotion, but we might express it in different ways, right? So it's not unusual for people. We normally think, okay, so people who are angry will start getting like tense and like Hulk-like and want to punch stuff. But anger also very often comes out in the form of crying, right? That you're just so angry that you cry. And that's not even gender specific or gender gender dysphoric. It doesn't. That applies to both males, females, everyone in between. So sometimes it depends on the situation. Sometimes like we'll get so mad we want to punch something, and then sometimes we'll get so mad we just want to cry, right? And the same goes with happiness. Sometimes happiness is expressed in different ways. It's expressed with cheering and yay, or it's expressed through crying. So there is a difference. Let's say between there could be a difference in how people express emotions, or even how we express emotions at given times, right? So when we talk about content, we're referring to a specific kind of emotion that a person experiences. So this is the specific type of emotion, the anger, the happiness, the fearfulness or anxiety. Style refers to how the emotion is expressed, right? So even when it comes to expressing something like fear, people will sometimes cry when they're scared. Sometimes they'll freeze, right? Deer in the headlights. Sometimes they'll make jokes. Sometimes they'll laugh, right? So, it, no surprise that some of the best comedians are completely crazy. And I say that as someone who's got his own neuroses and anxiety issues there. I can relate to them, right? So in awkward situations and scary situations, I tend to make jokes that, unfortunately some students, I don't intend for them to be offended or feel awkward. But yeah, like sometimes if we're dealing with really touchy subjects in class that I think are important to talk about, I might make a joke about it. Why? Well, because that's how I deal with anxiety, or that's how I deal with fear or difficult things. And part of that's just probably my upbringing in an Irish Catholic family. If any of you know about the stereotypical Irish wake, there's no crying in an Irish wake. Everyone gets drunk and tells jokes and tells stories about the dead person, sing a whole bunch of songs, and then usually a fight breaks out and the cops get called. I'm kidding. I'm making fun of my own. You guys got to take social psychology with me when we talk about stereotypes. There's sometimes a little bit of truth to them there. But anyway, the point being is the content is the actual emotion. The style is how we actually express it. So content and style might have trait-like properties, meaning that they could be stable over time and situations, and thus making them meaningful in terms of distinguishing between people. I can agree with that, right? I been critical. I've offered you a critical perspective of personality psychology, but like I said, I have gallows humor. I mean, when life sucks, I tend to make jokes about it, right? Yes. What else can we do, really? That tends to be pretty stable trait in there. So just for my own personal experience, like, it would be hard for me to disagree with that statement. But research suggests that this is true. In general, is that people will tend to their style of emotion tends to be stable. Those who cry when they're angry will typically cry when they're angry, right? Again, sometimes it's situational, but we could also see these long-term type of patterns that emerge there. Okay, so when it comes to content versus style of emotional life, we say the content of emotional life, we'll go into each of these in more detail here, but this is the typical emotions a person is likely to experience over time. The style of emotional life is the typical expression of those emotions that a person is likely to experience over time. And then, of course, there's this interaction between the emotion and the expression of the emotion that happens in emotional life. And again, sometimes the environment is important. Sometimes the environment will play a role, or sometimes other things going on in our lives, right? Sometimes anger will just reduce you to tears because there's just so much shit. Like, how much more can we take, right? You're so angry that it's breaking you down, essentially, right? But let's go through each of these here. So, content of emotional life, right? So these are the actual, say, emotion or emotions that we experience. So, in lists of primary emotions that personality psychologists or emotion researchers have come up with, happiness and joy are typically the only pleasant emotions that are mentioned. Though some theorists, some researchers will also include interest as a pleasant emotion. But typically when we are speaking about pleasant emotions, we're talking about happiness and joy. And in trait approaches to emotion, the major pleasant disposition is happiness, and the associated feelings of being happy is feeling a satisfaction or feeling satisfied with one's own life, right? So when it comes to pleasant emotions, we're talking about happiness and life satisfaction. Things I wish we all could experience. These are our goals. Actually, they're not necessarily goals to reach for. Remember, if you don't know what Eleanor Roosevelt said, I'm going to totally butcher her quote here, but said happiness is not a goal. It's a byproduct. And according to Eleanor Roosevelt, at least, happiness comes from helping other people and leading or living a meaningful life. If you strive to make happiness a goal, if you strive to live a happy life, you're gonna fail, because happiness is not something you can strive for. It's not a goal in and of itself. It's a byproduct. Get some Eastern religion and Eastern philosophy rooted in that, but again, you take social psych with me, or if you have taken social psych with me, you know how incredibly social we are as humans. And yeah, we helping other people does a lot for us, not just in terms of our happiness, but also our self-esteem. But that's for another class there, right? So, in this regard, pleasant emotions, happiness, satisfaction with life, and researchers have defined happiness in two complementary ways. Judgment that life is satisfying, and a predominance of positive emotions to negative emotions. So, what does that mean? Well, it means you have more positive emotions than negative emotions. Now, this is a predominance, which we can kind of think of as a preponderance, right? So, in this regard, so long as you have more positive emotions, more happy emotions, let's say, then negative emotions will consider you happy. But it could be like 51 to 49%, right? I don't know what the cutoff is. I'm not an emotion researcher. So I guess so long as you have more positive emotions than negative emotions, you're happy. Or so long as you say that life is satisfying, right? But we just went through 2 chapters of psychoanalysis and Freudian theory, and defense mechanisms are real there. So, moving along for now, self-report and non-self-report measures of happiness correlate with self-report scores on social desirability. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when we ask people if they're happy, they're likely to say yes, because that's the socially desirable answer to give. Let's use a real-world example. Take a look at Facebook. Take a look at your Instagram. Take a look at your Twitter, whatever social media that you're on, right? People are posting their best versions of themselves, right? They're all in it for the thumbs up and the likes and the hearts, right? How many people are posting on Facebook, my life sucks, like life is shit, right? Okay, not a whole lot of people do that, and those who do, we might be taken aback by it, right? If somebody says, yeah, you know what, I really don't know what the hell, what's the purpose in all of this stuff. We might say, oh, let's reach out and be a good friend and whatnot. But what if they keep saying this like over and over again? Like, yes, it's all big nothing. And I don't know. Research shows you're likely to unfriend that person, right? So self-reports of happiness tend to be associated with social desirability. So we can't really rely on people's self-reports of how happy they are. And I mean, when it comes to social media, you can't rely on any of that shit being true at all, right? So part of being happy is to have positive illusions about oneself. So an inflated view of the self is actually good. Narcissists tend to be very positive about themselves. They tend to think very highly of themselves. So they tend to be pretty happy. All right. So this we all know the idiom that ignorance is bliss, right? And yeah, sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's, for the sake of happiness, sometimes it's better to not know something than to know it, right? For the sake of happiness, sometimes it's better to have an inflated sense of your abilities or your looks or your desirability or whatever the case may be. At least for the moment, I would argue that shit's gonna catch up to you at some point. But if you can maintain these types of illusions or delusions, they can make you feel good. Certainly, that's true. That's what a bunch of those defense mechanisms are all about, right? Also, survey measures of happiness and well-being predict other aspects of people's lives one would expect to be related to happiness. So, this is some evidence that shows survey measures of happiness might not be so bad. They are associated with social desirability, so we might be inclined to not tell people how much our lives suck. We'll only tell them about the good aspects of our lives. But compared to unhappy people these are self-reports, right? So compared to unhappy people, happy people are less abusive and less hostile. They report fewer diseases and illnesses. They tend to be more helpful, more creative, more energetic, more forgiving, and more trustworthy. So these self-reports are associated with observable behaviors, right? Observable traits. So the self-reports of happiness, by and large, can be valid and trustworthy. Just understand you might not be getting, the whole picture there. Okay, so when it comes to what do we know about, let's say, quote unquote, happy people? Happiness is one of those psychological constructs, one of these theoretical constructs that we don't really have a good definition of. We saw just a few slides ago that we define it in terms of people's satisfaction, their self-reports of satisfaction with life, and having a predominance of positive emotions over negative emotions. Okay, you could decide whether those are good definitions of happiness. Maybe if they might be good for short term. Are they going to be good in the long term? Are these going to produce what Maslow or Rogers would consider self-actualization, right? Or are these kind of hedonistic, living in the moment types of definitions? I don't know, right? That's up to you to decide. But what we know about happy people, there are no sex differences in overall happiness, or again, this is assuming the gender binary, biological male and female. We know that trans people, all people in the LGBT community suffer from greater risks of depression and anxiety disorders and substance abuse and suicide attempts and all that. But when we talk about just say the binary, biological male, biological female, doesn't seem to be any overall differences in happiness or well-being or life satisfaction. And that exists across cultures and across countries in terms of these sex differences not existing, right? Also, no age difference in overall happiness. Although circumstances that make people happy might change with age. So overall ratings of happiness might not change as we get older, but the types or the things that make us happy might change. So you could even think back and just, what made you happy as a kid compared to what makes you happy right now, and then think about, well, what's going to make you happy in 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 50 years from now. Those things might change. When it comes to ethnic group membership, this is unrelated to subjective well-being. National differences can exist in subjective well-being, and this is primarily based on the poverty levels that exist within countries. So people in poor countries are less happy. That seems to be common sense, right? When food and basic necessities are your primary goal, and not always available, you have less time to focus on things that are going to make your life fulfilling or satisfying. Again, if we think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these basic needs of food and shelter need to be satisfied first, right? People in countries that provide citizens fewer civil and political rights are less happy. Again, if you take social psych, or if you take particularly applied social psych with me, we talk a lot about reactance theory. Humans like freedom. No, we can't always handle it. But oppressive systems of government will make us less happy. Differences in the economic development of nations may be a key source of differences in the happiness of countries. So, yeah, no shit, right? If you're struggling to eat, life is probably gonna not be so great for you. Then we get to this question of whether money can buy us happiness. Well, yes and no. Like the research suggests to a degree. We'll talk globally now, and then I'll give you a statistic here on an individual level, right? But like the Beatles said, money can't buy love. I don't know how much money are we talking about, right? But by happiness. Well, let's see what the research shows. Wealthier countries have higher levels of life satisfaction than poorer countries. National wealth is confounded with a whole bunch of variables that can influence well-being, such as healthcare, services, and education. So maybe it's not necessarily the money. Maybe it's the stuff that comes with the money, right? Like healthcare, education, infrastructure, transportation, crime rates, right? All of those things are confounded with wealth. So it's kind of hard to tease it out. It's kind of hard to see which one, which of these are actually affecting people's happiness, because there's lots of correlations there. Researchers tend to try to address these problems by looking at the relationship between income and happiness within countries. So let's say within the United States, are richer people happier than poorer people, let's say, right? So that kind of gets around some of these issues, except that we don't have a national healthcare program, and also poorer neighborhoods tend to have more crime. So not sure we're fully getting around these problems, but we're getting closer at least. And in very poor countries, economic status will predict happiness. However, once people can afford basic necessities, increasing financial status is not related to well-being. So this basically is saying as soon as you are able to live a comfortable life, there's really no increase in happiness with the more money that you make. And that number in the United States is $75,000. So as of the latest research that I've looked at, so I'm prepping my applied social psych class where we talk about these issues of wealth inequality and psychological and social effects of it. About $75,000. If we all made $75,000, we would all be pretty damn happy. After that, doesn't seem to be an appreciable increase in happiness with more money. It tends to go up, and then it's what we call the law of diminishing returns, right? So closer you get to 75 G's, happy you get, and then it kind of flatlines, kind of like levels out. More money isn't really going to do much more for you after that point, right? Because 75 per person, not per household, and not on Long Island or in New York City, that's still not a lot of money. Still, and with student loan debt and also we could go on and on, right? But generally speaking, on average, in the United States, 75 G's is the cost to be happy. I hope I can be happy one day soon. Yes. That would be nice. 75 G's would be nice. Okay, so in terms of does money make people happy, how can poverty be associated with so many problems, yet income is unrelated to happiness, right? Well, you take a look at poverty and all the issues, all the bad things that come with poverty, but income, after that $75,000 mark in the U.S., we don't see like an appreciable difference in happiness levels, right? They kind of tend to level up. So what's going on? How can this be? Well, we'll take a look at the two answers here, but just from a social perspective, because I have to throw that in. Poverty tends to be a systemic issue, right? Unless you're, physically or mentally, developmentally unable to make a living, people who are in poverty are there because there's really shitty jobs out there. Most people who are in poverty work full-time jobs, sometimes two full-time jobs, right? So there's this whole notion of the working poor, where income tends to be very individualized, right? When we talk about income, this is how much I personally make. So I think it's important that we think of these two things as something different. We're typically born into poverty, and it's very difficult to move out of the social class you're born in. I know we have the American dream, but I don't know. George Carlin, famous comedian, modern day philosopher, said they call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe in it. And that might sound really cynical, but the research shows that, you are born into the social class that you're going to die in. So if you're born poor, you're likely to die poor. Born rich, you're likely to die rich. If you're born somewhere in between, God knows what the way this economy is going, right? But when it comes to this answer, what your textbook says, or this question, what your textbook says, the answer may lie in the notion of a threshold of income, so below which a person is unlikely to be happy, And once a person is above this threshold of income, more income doesn't produce more happiness. So basically everything I just spent 15-20 minutes talking about summarized in one sentence. And that number is 75,000 in the United States. So the absence of health and wealth bring misery, but the presence of health and wealth doesn't necessarily guarantee happiness, right? So we could think of that in sorts of maybe taking some things for granted. So, you know, if we're lucky, right, we are typically happy and we have our basic necessities met. So we're kind of not really experiencing happiness or satisfaction from that. But as soon as those things are taken away, once our ability to pay rent or buy food, or we come down with, you know, a debilitating illness, well, we're gonna notice that shit, right? And that's going to affect us, affect our happiness levels there. Okay, so speaking of health and happiness, let's get into a little bit about personality and well-being. So there's a whole subfield of psychology devoted to well-being, psychology and well-being, health psychology, right? Health psychology came out of social psychology. It was one of these applied types of fields that I don't say got co-opted. I mean, we're all psychologists, but it's tending to take on more of a clinical type of feel to it, let's say. So it explains why it might be presented in this class, personality psychology class. So some of the research findings that we see here is that high extroversion and low neuroticism contribute more to happiness than gender, ethnicity, age, and any other demographic characteristics. So being outgoing and being less neurotic is your key to happiness, right? A lot easier said than done. Might not be your key to happiness, but those two factors there contribute more to your level of happiness than any of your demographic information. Models of relationship between personality and well-being. Well, there's two. The indirect model, which basically says that personality causes a person to create a certain lifestyle, and that lifestyle causes an emotional reaction, which will lead to well-being if it's a good emotional reaction, right? If it's not so great emotional reaction, if your personality kind of creates a lifestyle that is setting you up to have bad emotions, then you're likely to have low well-being, right? You're likely not to be doing so great. So this would be the indirect model, where your personality basically creates, or through your personality, you will create a lifestyle that is either going to foster your well-being or be detrimental to your well-being. When it comes to the direct model, the direct model says, nope, it's not about creating a lifestyle. Your personality just causes these emotional reactions that are good or bad. And we'll get to this in a second here, but just to give you a preview, I'm sure you've heard of type A and type B personalities, right? And how they are related to health. Those would be, well, type A would be an example of a direct model. That, no, you just have a certain type of personality disorder that's gonna give you like heart disease and a stroke and all these other problems, high blood pressure and whatnot, during, down the line. It's not about you creating an environment that's going to give you those things. Your personality just going to give you those things to begin with. So what does the research say? Well, according to Larson, the person who wrote your textbook here, to assess the direct model, the best predictor of responsiveness to positive mood is extroversion. So people who are more extroverted will have a more responsive, I want to say responsive response. That's silly. Will have a greater response to positive mood. Also, the best predictor of responsive to negative mood is neuroticism. So, essentially, what we saw before, in terms of the personality traits most associated with happiness is high extroversion, low neuroticism. So, it's easy to put an extrovert into a good mood and a high neuroticism person, let's just say a neurotic person, into a bad mood. So people's personalities might predispose them to being in certain types of mood, or feeling certain types of emotions, right? So the research suggests that personality does have a direct effect on emotion, at least when it comes to these two personality traits or factors, right? Neuroticism and extroversion. Okay, so when it comes to unpleasant emotions, like anxiety or neuroticism, again, people high on neuroticism tend to be more irritable, they tend to be more moody, they tend to be more anxious, more pessimistic, tend to complain a lot more than others who are low on neuroticism. We see Isaac is back here. Isaac is back here. Remember Isaac's biological theory. He says that neuroticism is due to tendencies of the limbic system in the brain to become easily activated. So remember, his theory of personality was rooted very strongly in biology and physiology, right? So heredity, genes, physiology. So neuroticism might just be an oversensitive limbic system, which is kind of how we treat or how we think of anxiety disorders, particularly panic disorder, as an overactivation of, say, the limbic system in the brain. So he might have been onto something before, before we even really got a clearer understanding of anxiety or panic disorders there. So remember that the limbic system is responsible for the emotion of fight or flight. So we can hopefully see how that activation would be related to anxiety or fear, neuroticism, essentially. Right? So Isaac's arguments in favor of a biological basis for neuroticism is based on a couple of, say, research findings. One is that neuroticism tends to be pretty stable over time. So we don't tend to change too much in regard to this personality trait. That's something that we saw in I forget the exact chapter, but one of the earlier chapters when we were talking about personality changes and consistency over time, right? We also see that, we also know that neuroticism is a major dimension of personality. This has been confirmed by the Big Five model through factor analysis. There's also through twin studies that we've seen, and in the chapter on genetics and personality, that neuroticism shows high levels of heritability. So there might be a genetic component to neuroticism. Some cognitive theories, so these will basically take a different approach to anxiety and these negative affectivity, some of these negative emotions, right? Neuroticism. The cognitive theories say that neuroticism is caused by styles of information processing. So the way that our brains are wired to process certain information might be to process this information in a negative or neurotic type of way. So information processing characteristics appear to relate to the preferential processing of negative information about the self. In other words, some of us might have our brains wired to process information in a way that is negative towards ourselves, and that can be due to environmental type of factors such as abuse or neglected a neglected childhood. I don't want to get into too much the issue, say, adult survivors of childhood abuse or neglect, but sometimes as a kid, as a child, I mean, your brain is a blank slate, essentially, right? So you might come to learn to process certain information, certain stimuli that are going on around you in a way that is not favorable to you and have nothing to do with your genes or your biology per se, right? I mean, the brain is wiring itself in a way to have these types of counterproductive thoughts or this negative information processing. But that's because of the environment that brain evolved in, that brain was constructed in, for lack of a better word, right? Therapy is all about undoing those connections and forming new ones. And remember, your brain gets less flexible as you get older. So the sooner you can get in therapy, the better. Also, when dealing with these cognitive theories, a related explanation holds that people high in neuroticism have richer networks of association surrounding memories of negative emotions. So people who are high in neuroticism might actually just have much stronger, or not just stronger, but actually might have more memories that are associated with negative emotions or negative experiences in their lives compared to people who have lower levels of neuroticism. So unpleasant material is going to be much more easily accessible to these individuals. It's going to be much easier to recall bad thoughts or bad material, bad experience, bad emotions for these people than pleasant ones. Okay, So one type of unpleasant, say, information is poor health. So individuals high in neuroticism are likely to recall more instances of illness and bodily complaints. This could be related to an anxiety disorder, though, right? So there's such a thing as hypochondriasis. Sure, you've heard, somebody be referred to as a hypochondriac, but hypochondriasis or health anxiety. And it's not necessarily not necessarily a personality trait. It's related to legit anxiety disorders, including PTSD from, again, abusive or neglectful childhood experiences. So major disease categories tend to have little relation to neuroticism. So when we talk about, say, big ticket items, cancer, heart disease, things like that, we don't see any more complaints from people high in neuroticism. So people who score high in neuroticism tend to recall instances of, say, more mild type of complaints and more bodily ailments. But again, anxiety as a mental health issue, anxiety can cause there's no such thing as like a mental health illness, right? I mean, your brain is part of your body, so if it's happening in your brain, it's a physiological response, and anxiety has been known to produce any symptom imaginable. Imagine any symptom anxiety could produce that. So again, some of this stuff, I don't know about some of this stuff, right? Also, neuroticism is related to diminished immune functioning during stress. That is absolutely true. So people who are high in neuroticism or high in anxiety have a diminished immune system during those times of high stress. People who have PTSD, again, even adult survivors of childhood abuse and neglect, would likely be diagnosed with PTSD. There's a whole line of research out there that discusses PTSD as an autoimmune disorder, which makes which complicates things, let's say, a lot more during this pandemic, right? Not just for veterans who are coming back from war, who are suffering PTSD, and suicide rates at, alarming rates of suicide and substance abuse and PTSD. But again, adult survivors of childhood abuse and neglect, who will likely would be diagnosed with PTSD if they receive proper treatment. These people are immunocompromised, right? And they might not even know it. We're in the middle of a pandemic here. So there's a whole bunch of mental health issues that are not being addressed. It's the fact that we've all been locked up in our houses for 7 months here, right? Remember what I was saying before about humans being social animals here. We also have Matthew's attentional theory that states that high neuroticism people may pay more attention to threats and unpleasant information in their environments. So just according to this theory, it's an attentional theory. So have a cognitive component that people with higher neuroticism might just be more in tune to potential threats. Again, like I said, if some of these people with high neuroticism grew up in abusive families, yeah, it's called hypervigilance. You're always on the lookout for potential fights or potential threats to yourself or others. You have a heightened awareness to bad things, because it's a defense mechanism. It's what kept these people alive as kids, going through these abusive childhoods, right? Okay, so moving past the anxiety issues and moving on to more of the mood disorders, depression and melancholia. You have the diathesis stress model that says stressful life events can trigger depression among those with pre-existing vulnerabilities. Absolutely, right? And according to this model, though, these pre-existing vulnerabilities are personality-based pre-existing vulnerabilities. That's not typically how we view depression or the current understanding of depression. Nobody really knows how depression works. It's just the truth of the matter. Nobody really knows why antidepressants work. Antidepressants actually don't work for everybody. They tend to work pretty well for about a third of the people who take them, and tend to work somewhat for the other third, and do nothing for the remaining third. Don't work at all. You also have the issue of, well, if depression is a quote-unquote chemical imbalance, we just don't have enough serotonin in the brain. Well, it only takes a couple days for any of these SSRIs, these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, to reach peak level in your body, which means your brain is getting flooded with serotonin pretty quickly. So if it were a chemical imbalance, so to speak, these medications shouldn't take 6, 8, sometimes 12 weeks before you know whether or not they're going to work, right? You should be able to take some Lexapro or Zoloft for 2 or 3 days and boom, problem solved. It should be like MDMA. You pop some Molly, some ecstasy, and it floods your brain with serotonin. People will feel good from it, right? But that's not what happens. So the current model or current thinking, again, nobody really knows. But the current thinking is that depression is actually a result of parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that are responsible for mood and responsible for executive planning, or basically getting your ass off the couch and showering and going to work and doing all that stuff. That parts of that prefrontal cortex, some of these nerves die off or damaged, likely due to cortisol, the stress hormone. So prolonged stress will result in these parts of the brain essentially being damaged or dying off. And that you will come out of a depressive episode. On average, a depressive episode lasts about 9 months without treatment. It's a long time to be depressed. With treatment, it's about 4 or 5 months. Still a long time, right? But a lot better. But the thinking is that depression is kind of a reset button. Just think about what we're going to see in the next slide. So let's just go to the next slide here. Take a look at some of these signs of depression. What do they all kind of signal to you, right? Don't they all kind of diminish interest or pleasure in most activities, depressed mood most of the day, change in sleep patterns, insomnia or sleeping too much, restlessness, agitation, fatigue, loss of energy, diminished ability to concentrate, recurring thoughts of death or suicide. All of these things signal to me your brain saying, yeah, we need a time out. All that stress, like work, fuck work, right? All, like, your friends, fuck them. Like, family, fuck it, fuck everything. We're not caring about any of this stuff, because we need a break from stress. We need no more cortisol, right? Because we need to heal ourselves. Depression is kind of taking you out of the game, essentially. It's making you not give a shit about anything. And that's kind of what you need to heal, in a way, right? Is that your brain needs time. It's a complete myth that brain cells don't regenerate. That's stupid anti-drug propaganda. So, yes, absolutely. You will heal. Now, again, average length of a depressive episode is 9 months, which means there are plenty of people who are going way past that. The current thinking is that antidepressants help speed up the healing process by having more serotonin in the brain. So basically, these SSRIs, Prozac, Lexapro, Zola, what have you, Paxil, basically allow more serotonin to exist in the brain, and this kind of provides a healing type of environment, so to speak. But yeah, they're not cure-alls. They're not happy pills by any means. Something interesting that I'm pretty sure I've already spoke about, there are some drugs that will take people out of depression almost instantaneously, and they're psychedelics and disassociatives. So something like ketamine. Google ketamine clinic. You'll find plenty near you, right? I think there's one in Syracuse if you're in Oneonta. If you're downstate, there's a bunch of them that you can go to. All legit. Ketamine, also psilocybin, mushrooms, LSD, all of these things have pretty amazing effects on depression and curing depression. No one understands quite why. One theory is that they're actually affecting the neurotransmitter glutamate instead of serotonin and norepinephrine, which is what most antidepressants focus on. But yeah, nobody's 100% sure how depression works. But depression is usually, like a major depressive episode is usually a life-changing event. You come out of it a happier person. It basically forces you to stop whatever the hell you're doing. You stop and you need to reevaluate everything, right? So again, with therapy in a supportive environment, could be beneficial. There's some evolutionary theorists, evolutionary psychologists who make some compelling arguments as to why depressive episodes or mental breakdowns, quote unquote, are evolutionarily advantageous. But just going back quickly here to Beck's cognitive theory. So Beck is, we'll see, he's got a couple of depression scales. So somebody definitely studies depression from a cognitive perspective. And he states that certain cognitive styles as pre-existing conditions can make people vulnerable to depression. So this is the way that we process some information. Can make us more depressed, right? And again, the idiom ignorance is bliss. Yeah, well, especially nowadays, right? If you're following the news every day and like if you're keeping track of what's going on around in the world, it's kind of hard for people not to be depressed, right? It's the people who are not really paying attention. So it would be easier for those people to be happy because they don't know how bad it is really out there, right? Also, this vulnerability might lie in a particular cognitive schema. So this is the way that we view the world, right? So we think, again, might be reductionist to say, some of us are pessimists and some of us are optimists because, yeah, sometimes we're pessimists, sometimes we're optimists, right? It depends on what's going on out there. But if we have a particular schema that we just tend to view humans as horrible animals and nothing they do is good, then yeah, chances are we're probably gonna be depressed, right? We try to find the good in some people. We might have a fighting chance in there. And Beck has this idea of the cognitive triad, which is that it's not just information about the world, but it's also information about yourself and information about the future. So if you tend to be optimistic or pessimistic about you, and optimistic or pessimistic about the world, or optimistic and pessimistic about the future, these will all matter in terms of developing, say, depression or depressed types of emotion, right? Clinical depression, it's not really a thing. Clinical depression, it's major depressive disorder. It's a clinical diagnosis, but not all states of going through some of this stuff. I mean, we're human. We're all going to feel like this. There are specific, let's say, criteria that you need to have for a certain amount of time before you are diagnosed with a depressive disorder. Okay, I'm just going to try to speed it up here because I promised you I'd try to keep these lectures a little shorter. So anger proneness and potential for hostility. So we spoke about a little bit, or we previewed the idea of the type A personality, right? So the type A personality is the person who is constantly, let's say, multitasking. They're always in a rush. They always got something to do. They always got. They're very ambitious. They're very competitive, so on and so forth. This is compared to, say, a type B personality, who tends to be, more chill, more relaxed, less competitive, more cooperative, want to get along, want to help people out, things like that. Well, the research has shown that type A personality is a contributor to heart disease. Actually, a pretty significant contributor to heart disease. Type A people also tend to be workaholics and tend to prioritize work sometimes at the expense of their friends and their family. And newer research, pretty recent research, has shown that the number one predictor for longevity, for a long life, is actually having a close set of friends. Not a large set of friends, but a small but close set of friends. So type A personalities are typically not interested in developing those types of relationships. They would be more interested in developing, say, acquaintances or business relationships, networking, so on and so forth. So research subsequently identified hostility as a trait of type A that was most strongly related to heart disease. So we know type A personality is a contributor to heart disease, and it's likely the hostility that people with type A personality tend to feel. So what exactly is hostility? Well, this is the tendency to respond to everyday frustrations with anger and aggression, to become easily irritated, and to act in rude, critical, antagonistic, and uncooperative ways in everyday types of situations. Basically, to be an asshole. Nobody likes assholes. Even if you make it to the top, you'll be there alone in the end, right? Okay, so we talked a whole lot about the content of emotional life. We'll now talk about, say, style of emotional life. So remember, we said that the emotional content is what we're actually feeling, right? And the style is how that feeling is expressed. So emotional content refers to the what of a person's emotional life, whereas the style refers to, say, the how. So what we're feeling, content, style, how is it expressed? We can think of in terms of how it's expressed, in terms of intensity, right? So some of us are going to experience, let's say, anger. Well, we all are going to experience anger and sadness and all of that, and happiness, the good stuff too, right? But some of us might experience it more intensely. So people will have very strong emotions, right? So when they're happy, they're really happy. When they're sad, they're really sad. And then some of us, like me, tend to have a more muted or less intense, let's say, response, or less intense emotions. So, when I get happy, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's cool, right? Mm. And when I'm sad, well, it's basically just how I am. Oh, that's like my default. Again, gallows humor. Yeah, but I tend to be kind of, I don't really experience intense emotions, which kind of sucks. Well, anxiety, right? I get anxiety, intense anxiety sometimes. Um, TMI there, but we can think of affect intensity as an emotional style. So how an emotion is presented or expressed, we can think of it in terms of its intensity, right? So high affect intensity people experience emotions strongly, and they're emotionally reactive and variable. So people with high affect intensity, you're going to experience emotions much more strongly than people with low affect intensity. And their emotions will be more variable. There'll be less stability. Why? It's because they're going really high on the good emotions, and then really low on the bad emotions. Compared to people who are less affect intensive. We tend to just kind of be in the middle, more in the middle, little less variable, let's say. So low affect intensity people experience emotion only mildly and with only gradual fluctuations and minor reactions. I would put myself in that category, but trust me, there have been plenty of situations, environmental factors, or environmental situations where I flew off the fucking handle. I totally popped off. So, again, we're talking about people's general dispositions. The situation plays a major role in this as well. So, in terms of, assessing affect intensity and mood variability in early studies, affect intensity was assessed using a daily experimental sampling technique. So, what does that mean? Each day, people would check in with participants in terms of, and ask them, what's their mood and what's the intensity of their mood. These were self-report measures, so subject to social desirability, and they were also kind of clumsy. That's the best kind of way to put this daily experimental sampling. Later research developed the affect intensity measure or the AIM, and this is a questionnaire, so it's standardized. It's less quote unquote clumsy. It's more standardized measure that allows a quick assessment of a person's emotional style in terms of their intensity. So it's a scale. It's a measure that standardized this process of basically assessing people's emotions in terms of their intensity, right? So some of the research findings that we've seen over the years in terms of affect intensity or emotional intensity, high affect intensity individuals display greater mood variability or more frequent fluctuations in emotional life over time. We kind of already said that, right? Kind of makes sense that people who have high affect intensity are going to fluctuate between very high positive emotions and very low negative emotions, right? Affect intensity relates to personality dimensions on high activity level, sociability, and arousability, which we'll take a look at those in a second here. All right. So the interaction of content and style. So the what we're feeling and the how we express it. There's this hedonic balance between positive and negative emotions represents the content of emotional life. So how we navigate this, right? This balance that we strike here between what we feel in terms of positive and negative emotions and how we express them basically represents our emotionality, who we are as an emotional being, let's say, or as an individual emotional being. So affect intensity represents, again, the style of emotional life. And this is stuff that we've said before. So let's take a look quick at this slide here, or this graph rather, that takes a look at the quality of emotional life as a function of both content and style. So I kind of like this because it plots the two things that we were talking about, intensity and the actual mood, right? So we can, the actual mood, the positive affect, the negative affect. This is the content aspect of emotion. And intensity, this would be the style aspect of emotion, right? How we express it. So let's take a minute and just take a look at some of these. So let's start here with people who have high affect intensity. So these are people who are gonna feel the good emotions really strongly and feel the bad emotions really strongly, right? So people with frequent positive affect, so generally happy people who have a high intensity, they're likely to experience exuberance. They'll tend to be animated, joyful. They'll have enthusiasm, a zest for life, right? So these are, I'm sure we've encountered these people, but they're just, probably not someone, if you're like me, who you want to encounter first thing in the morning, right when I wake up before coffee, right? But definitely later on in the day, these are the people who kind of, alright, so given, like, you can get some of that positive vibes flowing here to get you through the day type of thing. So, frequent positive affect, but people who have low affect intensity. So, let's say, not displaying or feeling these emotions as strongly. So they're likely to be more easygoing. They're likely to experience life as more contentful. So they'll experience more contentment. They'll tend to be more calm, more tranquil. They're just chill, right? They're happy, but they're they're chilling. The opposite of this row here is the negative affect, right? So these are the people who have frequent negative emotions, and let's start with the high affect intensity people. So negative emotions, who experience them or express them very strongly. They're more likely to be agitated, to have negative affect, so bad mood, to feel distressed, feel aggravated, depression, and episodes of very strong anxiety. again, putting depression and anxiety in there as their mental illness is associated with these things, right? So we'll take them for what they are in this class. So when it comes to people who have low affect intensity but have frequent negative affect, so but maybe not so extreme in their negative affect, they tend to have frequent melancholia, so they tend to just kind of be in a perpetual state of melancholy, of low grade depression, kind of blah, type of feeling, mild but persistent unhappiness. So they're not happy, but it's not reaching a level of depression or something that might look like depression or resemble depression. So more along the lines of discontentment with life, just general feelings of being unsatisfied and feeling dejected, kind of withdrawn from society, not really wanting much to do with it, so to speak. So we see here basically how emotional life can serve as an interaction between, say, content and style of emotion. Okay, so our last slide here, some of the take-home points from this lecture is that emotions can be thought of as either states, things that are transitory, that kind of just exist in the moment and disappear, or as traits that tend to be long-lasting, tend to be kind of our general feelings or response to things that tend to stay stable over time. Emotional content is the types of emotional experiences that a person is likely to have. So the emotional content we can think of as the actual emotions that we have. And remember, there's debate about how many emotions actually exist, right? But emotional style we can think of as the way in which a person experiences these emotions, or how they express these emotions. So content and style interact within persons to produce distinctive varieties of emotional lives. So when it comes to emotions, we're all unique, we're all individual, because again, this chart puts 4 nice, neat little boxes. There are no boxes when we talk about humans. When it comes to anything related to humans, these boxes don't exist, right? So we should think of both of these as continuums, and these are just giving you an idea of where people might exist in these different dimensions, let's say. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. We're getting dangerously close to the end of the semester. Once November comes, time is gonna fly by. So let's make sure we all keep up, so we don't all go insane at the end of the semester, the last week or two. With that said, let me go get some sleep before I go insane. So I will see you all next week probably when you're watching this, I'll I'll see you soon when we have a live lecture. Okay? Take care, all. Bye-bye.